Native girl knocked on his door covered only in mud. He let her stay all night. The thunderclap that shook Elias Blackwood's cabin at midnight wasn't what woke him. It was the desperate pounding on his door that cut through the storm like gunshots through silence. Rain hammered the wooden shingles above his head as he rolled from his narrow bed, bare feet hitting the cold pine floor. Lightning split the darkness outside his single window, illuminating the sparse interior of his one-room dwelling for a heartbeat before plunging it back into shadow. Another series of frantic knocks echoed through the cabin, more urgent than before. Elias reached for the cold peacemaker on his knitstand, thumb sliding over the worn grip as he approached the door. In this corner of Wyoming territory, strangers arriving in the dead of night usually brought trouble. The nearest settlement was Deadwood Gulch. 20 miles south through treacherous mountain passes, and honest folk didn't travel these paths after dark. He pressed his ear to the thick wooden door, listening past the storm's fury. No voices, no horses snorting or saddle leather creaking. Just that persistent knocking, weaker now, as if whoever stood outside was losing strength. The wind howled through the pines surrounding his property, bending the massive trees until their branches scraped against his roof like skeletal fingers. Elias had built this cabin in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains for solitude, far from the chaos that had consumed his life in Denver. 3 years of peace, broken by whatever waited beyond his threshold. He lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured his door, keeping the revolver ready. The portal swung inward on leather hinges, and Elias stepped back in shock. A young woman stood in his doorway, swaying on unsteady legs. Her long black hair hung in wet tangles around her face, and her bronze skin was streaked with mud from head to toe. She wore nothing but the earth that clung to her trembling form, her dark eyes wide with exhaustion and something deeper, a fear that seemed to reach into her very soul. She collapsed forward, and Elias caught her instinctively, the cold mud transferring to his cotton undershirt. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, and he could feel her heart racing against his chest like a trapped bird. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination, he saw the scratches covering her arms and legs, fresh wounds from thorns and branches, as if she had run through miles of wilderness. Her feet were torn and bleeding, leaving crimson prints on his threshold. The storm intensified, driving rain through the open doorway and soaking them both. Elias glanced past her into the darkness, searching for any sign of pursuit, but saw only the writhing shadows of storm-lashed trees. Whatever had driven this woman to his door through such weather, she had come alone. He kicked the door shut and lowered the bar back into place, then carried her to his bed. The mud on her skin was mixed with something else. War paint, he realized, though it had been mostly washed away by the rain. Geometric patterns still clung to her cheekbones and forehead, the traditional designs of the Lakota tribe that roamed these mountains. Elias set his revolver aside and reached for the wool blanket folded at the foot of his bed. As he wrapped it around her shivering form, her eyes fluttered open, focusing on his face with startling intensity. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. Her lips were cracked and pale, her face gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. How long had she been running through the wilderness? He moved to his wash basin and filled a tin cup with water from the pitcher, returning to kneel beside the bed. She accepted the cup with trembling hands, drinking greedily until it was empty, then looked up at him with desperate gratitude. The fireplace had burned down to glowing embers, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Elias added fresh logs to the grate, coaxing the flames back to life. The warmth began to fill the small space, and he could hear the woman's breathing slow as the immediate cold released its grip on her body. He had seen plenty of Indian women during his years on the frontier, but none like this. Her features were refined, aristocratic even, with high cheekbones and full lips that spoke of noble blood. The remains of her war paint suggested she held some position of importance within her tribe. Elias fetched his spare shirt from a wooden chest and held it out to her. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine his intentions, then accepted the garment and pulled it over her head beneath the blanket. The cotton fabric hung loose on her slender frame, reaching nearly to her knees. The storm showed no signs of abating. Rain continued to pound the roof, and wind whistled through the gaps in the log walls. Whatever had happened to bring her here, she wouldn't be leaving until morning at the earliest. He prepared a simple meal of hardtack and beans, warming them over the fire while she watched from the bed. Her dark eyes followed his every movement, alert and intelligent despite her obvious exhaustion. When he offered her the plate, she ate with restrained hunger, as if forcing herself to take small bites despite her body's desperate need for sustenance. As she ate, Elias studied her more carefully. The scratches on her arms and legs formed patterns, some from thorns and branches, but others appeared deliberate, self-inflicted. Ritual scarification, perhaps, or marks of mourning. Among the Plains tribes, such wounds often accompanied periods of grief or spiritual trial. She finished the meal and set the plate aside, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. When she looked at him again, there was something different in her expression, not just gratitude, but a deep weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Elias retrieved a bottle of whiskey from his shelf and poured a small measure into a clean cup. She accepted it without hesitation, downing the amber liquid in one swift motion. The alcohol brought color back to her cheeks and seemed to steady her nerves. The fire crackled and hissed, sending sparks up the stone chimney. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the cabin, a strange peace had settled over them. Two strangers, thrown together by circumstances neither could have predicted, sharing warmth and shelter while the wilderness raged beyond their walls. She spoke finally, her voice stronger now though still rough from exposure. The words were in Lakota, a language Elias had learned during his years trading with various tribes. Her tone was formal, almost ceremonial, as if she were reciting something sacred. She was thanking him, he realized, but not just for the shelter and food. The words carried deeper meaning, acknowledgement of a debt that went beyond simple hospitality. In her culture, what he had done by taking her in during her moment of greatest vulnerability created a bond between them, one that carried significant spiritual weight. Elias responded in broken Lakota, assuring her that she was safe and could rest. His pronunciation was clumsy compared to her fluid speech, but she nodded with approval at his attempt to communicate in her language. She told him her name then, Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, and asked for his. When he replied, she repeated Elias several times, as if testing how the foreign syllables felt on her tongue. The exhaustion was winning its battle against her will to remain alert. Her eyelids grew heavy, and her body began to sway slightly as sleep beckoned. Elias stood and moved toward the wooden chair near the fireplace, intending to spend the night there, but Ayana caught his wrist as he passed. She shook her head and gestured to the bed, indicating there was room for both of them. The offer was practical rather than intimate. The cabin's single room provided no other sleeping arrangements, and the floor would be both cold and uncomfortable. Elias hesitated, aware of the implications. In the white settlements, such an arrangement would be scandalous, regardless of circumstances. But they were far from civilization's judgment, and survival often demanded abandoning social conventions. He extinguished the oil lamp and banked the fire, leaving just enough flame to maintain warmth through the night. Then he lay down on the far side of the narrow bed, keeping space between them while sharing the blanket's warmth. Ayana fell asleep almost immediately, her breathing deep and even. But Elias remained awake, staring at the ceiling while questions churned through his mind. What had driven her into the wilderness during such a violent storm? Why was she alone, without horse or supplies? And most troubling of all, was someone pursuing her? The scratches on her body suggested a hasty flight through dense forest. The war paint, though mostly washed away, indicated some kind of ceremony or ritual had been interrupted. Among the Lakota, such markings were not worn casually. Hours passed before sleep finally claimed him. His last conscious thought was of the woman beside him, curled beneath the blankets like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Whatever story had brought her to his door, it was far from over. Dawn arrived gray and sullen, the storm having passed but leaving behind a cold mist that clung to the mountainsides. Elias woke to find Ayanna already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed and staring out the small window at the dripping forest beyond. She had cleaned the remaining mud from her skin using water from the wash basin, revealing the full extent of her injuries. In addition to the scratches from her flight through the wilderness, there were older marks on her arms and shoulders, scars that spoke of a hard life on the frontier. But it was her face that held his attention. In the morning light, he could see the intelligence burning in her dark eyes, along with something else, a determination that suggested she was far from the helpless victim he had first imagined. She turned to find him watching her and smiled for the first time since her arrival. The expression transformed her features, revealing the beauty that exhaustion and fear had concealed. She was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 20 years old, with the poise and bearing of someone accustomed to respect and authority. Ayanna stood and moved to the window, pressing her palm against the glass as she studied the forest beyond. Her posture was tense, alert, as if she expected to see movement among the trees. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it, and her shoulders relaxed slightly. She spoke in English then, her words careful but clear. Her accent carried the musical cadence of her native tongue, but her grammar was precise, suggesting formal education, unusual for someone from the remote tribes that inhabited these mountains. "The storm has passed," she said, still gazing out at the misty landscape. "I must leave soon." Elias sat up in the bed, studying her profile against the window. "Leave for where? You came here with nothing. No horse, no supplies, no weapons. The nearest settlement is 20 miles through mountain passes." She turned to face him, and he saw the conflict playing out in her expression. Part of her wanted to trust him, to explain what had driven her to his door in the middle of the night. But another part held back, bound by secrets she wasn't ready to share. "I cannot stay," she said simply. "My presence here brings danger to you." The words confirmed his suspicions from the previous night. She was fleeing from something or someone, and her pursuers might not be far behind. In this lawless territory, disputes were often settled with violence, and innocent bystanders frequently became casualties. But Elias found himself reluctant to let her leave. Perhaps it was the vulnerability he had seen in her the night before, or the way she had trusted him with her safety when she had no other choice. Whatever the reason, the thought of her walking back into the wilderness alone troubled him deeply. He rose and began preparing breakfast, slicing bacon and heating coffee over the fire. Ayanna watched his movements with the same careful attention she had shown the night before, as if memorizing every detail of his behavior. "You speak English well," Elias observed as he worked. "Where did you learn it?" A shadow passed over her features. "The mission school at Fort Laramie. I was sent there as a child to be educated in the white man's ways." Her tone carried bitterness that spoke of painful memories. The government's policy of forced education for Indian children was supposed to civilize them, but it often succeeded only in creating people who belonged fully to neither world. "How long were you there?" he asked. 7 years. Long enough to forget much of what I had been before, but not long enough to become what they wanted me to be." She accepted a plate of bacon and hardtack, eating with the same careful restraint she had shown the night before. But now Elias could see it wasn't just hunger she was controlling. It was emotion, memories that threatened to overwhelm her if she let her guard down. The coffee was strong and bitter, but Ayanna drank it gratefully. The warmth seemed to give her strength, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "You have been kind to me, Elias Blackwood, more kind than I had any right to expect. But I cannot repay your generosity by bringing harm to your door." "What kind of harm?" he pressed. Who's following you? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup as if it might hold answers to questions she wasn't ready to ask. When she looked up, her eyes held the weight of decisions that would change everything. My father is Chief Standing Bearer of the Oglala Lakota. 3 days ago, he promised me in marriage to a war chief from the Crow Nation, a union meant to seal a peace treaty between our tribes. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from the dying fire. Elias felt the full weight of what she was telling him. She wasn't just any Indian woman seeking shelter. She was the daughter of a chief, promised to another man in a political marriage that would affect the delicate balance of power in the territory. And she had run away on the night before her wedding. Iron Wolf is not a kind man, Ayanna continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He has 3 wives already, all of whom bear the marks of his anger. The youngest died last winter, and there are whispers among the women that it was not illness. That took her. Elias set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, processing the implications of what she was telling him. Arranged marriages between tribes were common enough, but the picture she painted of her intended husband suggested something far darker than political necessity. Your father knows this? He asked. Ayanna's laugh held no humor. My father knows only what he chooses to see. Iron Wolf brings 50 warriors to the Alliance, along with promises of safe passage through Crow hunting grounds. In my father's eyes, this makes him a valuable ally, regardless of his treatment of women. She stood and moved to the fireplace, extending her hands toward the flames as if trying to absorb their warmth into her very bones. The morning light streaming through the window caught the copper highlights in her dark hair, and Elias found himself studying the graceful curve of her neck, the determined set of her shoulders. The ceremony was to take place at dawn yesterday, she continued. I was prepared by the women of my tribe, dressed in my mother's wedding garments, painted with the sacred symbols of marriage. But when they came to escort me to the ceremonial lodge, I was gone. How did you manage to escape? Elias asked, genuinely curious. Indian camps were tightly controlled, especially during important ceremonies. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. My grandmother was Cheyenne, captured in a raid when she was young. She never forgot the wilderness skills of her people, and she taught them to me in secret. While the other girls learned beadwork and cooking, I learned to move through forest without sound, to read the signs of weather and season, to survive on what the earth provides. She turned back to face him, and he could see pride flickering in her dark eyes. The sentries were watching for threats from outside the camp, not for a bride fleeing into the night. I slipped away during the dancing, when everyone was focused on the celebration feast. But they'll come looking for you, Elias said. It wasn't a question. Iron Wolf's warriors are skilled trackers. The storm may have washed away some of my trail, but they will find signs eventually. And when they do ... she didn't need to finish the thought. Elias found himself facing a decision he hadn't anticipated when he first opened his door to her desperate knocking. Harboring a runaway Indian bride was more than just a breach of territorial etiquette. It was an act that could spark violence between tribes and potentially involve the military garrison at Fort Laramie. But looking at her now, seeing the quiet desperation she tried so hard to conceal, he realized his choice had already been made somewhere in the dark hours of the previous night. How far do you think you got before the storm hit? He asked. She considered the question carefully. Perhaps 15 miles from the camp. I followed the river valley until the rain became too heavy to see, then climbed toward higher ground seeking shelter. That's when I saw the light from your window. Elias nodded, mentally calculating distances and travel times. If they're tracking you on foot, that gives us maybe half a day before they reach this area. On horseback, less. The word us had slipped out without conscious thought, but Ayanna caught it immediately. Her eyes searched his face with new intensity, looking for some sign of his true intentions. You cannot become involved in this, she said firmly. I am grateful for your shelter and food, but I will not see you harmed because of my choices. Little late for that, Elias replied with a wry smile. The moment I opened that door, I became involved. Besides, I've got my own reasons for staying clear of territorial authorities. It was the first hint he had given about his own past, and Ayanna picked up on it immediately. What did you do? Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as memories he had tried to bury rose to the surface. I was a deputy marshal in Denver 3 years ago. There was a man named Garrett Mills who ran a saloon and gambling house, but everyone knew his real money came from other sources: claim jumping, cattle rustling, things that were hard to prove in court. He paused, reaching for the whiskey bottle and taking a small sip before continuing. Mills had connections with some of the territorial politicians, so even when we had evidence against him, nothing ever stuck. Until we caught him red-handed selling rifles to a gang of road agents who'd been hitting supply wagons between Denver and Central City. Ayanna settled back onto the bed, sensing that this story was important, that it would help her understand the man who had given her shelter. The trial should have been straightforward, Elias continued. We had witnesses, we had the weapons, we even had one of the gang members willing to testify. But 2 days before the trial was set to begin, our key witness was found dead in an alley behind the Silver Dollar Saloon. The other witnesses suddenly developed memory problems, and the physical evidence disappeared from the marshal's office. What happened to Mills? Ayanna asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Charges dropped for lack of evidence. He walked out of that courtroom a free man. And that same night he celebrated by buying drinks for half the town. Elias's voice carried old anger, carefully controlled but still burning beneath the surface. But that wasn't the end of it, she guessed. No, it wasn't. See, Mills made one mistake. He got drunk and started bragging about how he'd outfoxed the law. Started talking about how easy it had been to arrange for our witness to have his accident. He was loud enough that several people heard him, including the dead man's brother. Elias stood and moved to the window, looking out at the mist-shrouded forest as if seeing ghosts among the trees. Word got back to me through unofficial channels. I could have tried to build another case, gone through proper legal procedures. But I'd learned something about territorial justice by then. It's not always found in courtrooms. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. Ayanna waited, understanding that he needed to tell this story at his own pace. I found Mills 3 nights later in his private office above the saloon, counting the money from his latest illegal ventures. He reached for a gun when he saw me, and I shot him. Self-defense, technically, but there were no witnesses, and Mills had enough friends in high places to make life very difficult for a deputy marshal who'd killed him. So you ran, Ayanna said softly. I resigned my commission and disappeared into the mountains before anyone could ask too many questions. Built this cabin as far from civilization as I could get, and I've been here ever since. She studied his profile as he stood silhouetted against the window. Do you regret it? Elias considered the question for a long moment. I regret that it came to that, but I don't regret seeing justice done, even if it cost me my career and my old life. The parallels between their situations weren't lost on either of them. Both had fled from lives that had become unbearable, seeking freedom in the wilderness despite the dangers that pursuit might bring. We're both outcasts now, Ayanna observed. Seems that way. He turned back to face her. Which gives us something in common. We both understand what it means to choose a hard path because the alternative is worse. She nodded slowly, a new understanding passing between them. The attraction that had been building since the previous night was complicated by more than just the circumstances of her arrival. They were two people who had been willing to sacrifice everything for their principles, and that created a bond deeper than mere physical desire. A sound from outside interrupted their conversation, the distant whinny of a horse carried on the morning wind. Both of them froze, listening intently for any other signs of approaching riders. Elias moved swiftly to his gun belt, hanging from a peg near the door, and strapped it around his waist. The familiar weight of the Colt against his hip was reassuring, a reminder of skills he hadn't needed to use in 3 years of peaceful isolation. "Stay away from the window," he instructed Ayanna, moving to peer carefully through the glass. The forest beyond was still and quiet, morning mist clinging to the pine boughs. But somewhere out there, horses and riders were moving through the wilderness. Another sound reached them, the creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of hooves on forest floor. Multiple horses, moving slowly and deliberately, as if their riders were searching for something. Ayanna joined him at the window despite his warning, her face pale but determined. "How many?" she whispered. "Hard to tell. At least 3, maybe more." Elias checked his revolver, ensuring all 6 chambers were loaded. Could be anyone. Trappers, traders, even military patrol from Fort Laramie. But they both knew it wasn't likely to be any of those. The timing was too coincidental, the careful approach too purposeful. Someone was looking for Ayanna, and they had tracked her to this remote corner of the Wyoming wilderness. "There," Ayanna breathed, pointing toward a gap in the trees about 200 yards from the cabin. Elias followed her gaze and saw them. 4 riders moving single file through the forest, their horses picking their way carefully over the rocky ground. Even at this distance, he could make out enough detail to confirm his fears. The men wore buckskin clothing and feathers in their hair, and they sat their horses with the easy grace of warriors who had spent their lives in the saddle. "Crow?" he asked. Ayanna nodded grimly. "Iron Wolf's best trackers. He must have sent them ahead while he follows with the main war party." The lead rider had stopped his horse and was examining the ground, reading sign that was invisible to Elias's untrained eye. After a moment, the man pointed toward the cabin and said something to his companions. "They've found the trail," Ayanna whispered. The 4 warriors began moving again, this time with more purpose, heading directly toward the cabin through the morning mist. In the pale daylight, Elias could see details that made his blood run cold, war paint streaking their faces. Weapons ready at hand, the cold determination of men who had been given a specific task and intended to see it completed. "How long before they reach the cabin?" Elias asked. "Minutes, not hours." Ayanna moved away from the window, her movements quick and decisive. "They will surround the building first, make sure I cannot escape again. Then they will demand that you surrender me. And if I refuse?" Her dark eyes met his steadily. "Then they will take me anyway, and you will die for your defiance." These are not men who negotiate. Elias felt the familiar cold calm settling over him, the same feeling he had experienced during dangerous situations as a deputy marshal. Time seemed to slow. His thinking became crystal clear, and his awareness of every detail around him sharpened to razor intensity. "There's another option," he said quietly. "What?" "We run. Together." Ayanna stared at him in shock. "You cannot be serious. You would abandon your home, your life here, for someone you met only last night?" "This isn't much of a life," Elias replied, gesturing around the sparse cabin. "And it's about to get a lot more complicated whether we run or stay. At least if we leave now, we control the terms of what happens next." He moved quickly to a wooden chest in the corner, pulling out supplies with practiced efficiency: ammunition, dried food, a spare shirt, a small pouch of gold coins he had saved from his marshal days. Everything fit into a leather saddlebag that he slung over his shoulder. "My horse is in the lean-to behind the cabin," he explained as he worked. "We can be mounted and away before they get close enough to stop us." "Where would we go?" Ayanna asked, but he could hear in her voice that she was already considering the possibility. "West, toward the Utah Territory. There are settlements there where nobody asks too many questions about a man's past. We could make new lives for ourselves." The sound of approaching hoofbeats was getting closer. Through the window, Elias could see the riders had spread out in a line, beginning to encircle the cabin just as Ayanna had predicted. Decide now, he said urgently. In 30 seconds it will be too late. Ayanna looked around the cabin one last time, her gaze lingering on the bed where she had found safety and warmth during the longest night of her life. Then she looked at Elias, seeing something in his eyes that made her decision for her. They moved with desperate efficiency toward the back of the cabin. Elias grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace while Ayanna pulled on his spare boots, which were far too large for her feet, but better than bare skin against the rocky mountain terrain. The lean-to stable behind the cabin housed Elias's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder who had served him faithfully during his years of isolation. The animal sensed the tension immediately, ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring as Elias quickly saddled him. Through the morning mist, they could hear the Crow warriors calling to each other in their native tongue, coordinating their approach to surround the cabin completely. Ayanna translated in urgent whispers as Elias secured their meager supplies to the saddle. They are confirming that all escape routes are blocked. The leader says to take me alive but kill any white man who interferes. Elias swung into the saddle and reached down to pull Ayanna up behind him. She settled against his back, her arms wrapping around his waist as Thunder shifted restlessly beneath their combined weight. Hold tight, Elias murmured, then spurred the horse forward. They burst from the lean-to at a full gallop, heading up the steep slope behind the cabin toward the rocky ridgeline that formed the backbone of the mountain. Thunder's hooves struck sparks from the stone as they climbed, the sure-footed animal finding purchase on terrain that would have challenged lesser horses. Shouts erupted from the forest below as the Crow warriors spotted their escape. Within moments, the thunder of pursuing hoofbeats echoed through the mountain air, but Elias had chosen his route carefully. The steep terrain favored a single horse over multiple riders, and Thunder knew these trails from 3 years of exploration. They crested the ridge as the sun finally burned through the morning mist, revealing a breathtaking vista of forested valleys and snow-capped peaks stretching to the western horizon. But there was no time to appreciate the beauty behind them. The pursuit was gaining ground as the Crow warriors pushed their horses up the treacherous slope. "There," Ayanna called over the wind, pointing toward a narrow canyon that cut between 2 towering rock formations. "If we can reach that passage, it leads to the old mining trails. They will have difficulty following us there." Elias guided Thunder down the far side of the ridge, the horse sliding on loose shale as they descended toward the canyon mouth. The rocky walls rose around them like cathedral spires, blocking out much of the morning sunlight and creating an echoing tunnel of stone. The canyon floor was littered with boulders and fallen trees, forcing them to slow their pace as Thunder picked his way through the obstacles. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded, but Elias knew it was only temporary. The Crow warriors would find another route, and their superior knowledge of the territory would eventually give them the advantage. As they emerged from the canyon into a broader valley, Ayanna suddenly stiffened against his back. "Stop," she said urgently. Elias reined in Thunder, scanning the landscape ahead for whatever had alarmed her. At first, he saw nothing but rolling grassland dotted with stands of aspen trees, their leaves shimmering gold in the morning breeze. Then he saw them, more riders, at least 6 of them, emerging from the tree line at the far end of the valley. These were not Crow warriors but Lakota, recognizable by their distinctive war bonnets and the way they sat their painted ponies. "Your father's men?" Elias asked. Ayanna nodded grimly. "Led by my brother, walks with Thunder. He was always father's favorite, the one chosen to inherit leadership of our band. He will not let me escape to bring shame upon our family." They were trapped between 2 groups of pursuers in a valley that offered little cover and no obvious escape routes. The rocky walls on either side were too steep for horses, and going back through the canyon would lead them directly into the Crow trackers. Elias studied the terrain with the tactical mind of a former lawman, looking for any advantage they could exploit. The aspen grove in the center of the valley offered concealment, but would also limit their mobility. The stream that meandered through the grassland might provide a route to follow, but water always flowed downhill, and down would take them closer to their pursuers. "How well do you know this area?" he asked Diana. "I hunted here as a child with my grandmother." "There is a place." She paused, looking around to orient herself. "Yes, there, where that lightning-struck pine stands alone. Beneath it is a hidden entrance to caves that run through the mountain. We could hide there until they give up the search." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than trying to outrun mounted warriors on terrain they knew better than he did. Ilias urged Thunder toward the ancient pine tree, its blackened trunk standing like a sentinel against the morning sky. The Lakota riders had spotted them and were approaching at a steady lope, not hurrying but not allowing them to escape either. From behind, Elias could hear the Crow warriors emerging from the canyon, their war cries echoing off the valley walls. They reached the lightning-struck pine just as both groups of pursuers converged on their position. Ayanna slipped from the saddle and began searching frantically among the rocks at the base of the tree, looking for the cave entrance she remembered from childhood. Ilias remained mounted, rifle ready, watching the approaching riders with the calm focus that had kept him alive during his years as a marshal. The Lakota were closer, led by a young warrior whose resemblance to Ayanna marked him clearly as her brother. His face was painted for war, and the lance in his hand bore fresh scalps, evidence that diplomacy was not on his mind. "Sister," Walks with Thunder called out as his party drew within speaking distance. "You have shamed our family and dishonored our father. Surrender now, and I will ask Iron Wolf to be merciful when he claims his bride." "I will not be given to that monster," Ayanna replied, still searching among the rocks. "One choose my own path, brother, as is my right as a free woman." "You are the daughter of a chief," Walks with Thunder responded coldly. "Your rights are what serve the good of our people. Your marriage to Iron Wolf will bring peace between the Lakota and Crow. Your selfish desires matter nothing against that. Greater need." The Crow warriors had reached the edge of the grove now, close enough for Elias to see the war paint on their faces and the weapons in their hands. They had stopped their advance, apparently content to let the family dispute play out before making their own move. "Found it," Ayanna whispered urgently. She had located a narrow gap between two boulders, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was concealed by brush and would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. But they faced a problem. Thunder couldn't follow them into the caves, and leaving the horse behind would strand them underground with no means of escape once their pursuers discovered the entrance. Elias made a quick decision. He dismounted and slapped Thunder's rump, sending the faithful horse galloping toward the far end of the valley. The animal would lead the pursuers away from the cave entrance, buying them precious time to disappear into the underground passages. "Go," he told Ayanna, helping her squeeze through the narrow opening between the rocks. She disappeared into the darkness beyond, and Elias followed quickly, pulling brush across the entrance behind them to conceal any sign of their passage. The cave beyond was pitch black and smelled of dampness and ancient stone. They felt their way forward through the darkness, following a narrow tunnel that seemed to lead deeper into the mountain. Behind them, they could hear voices calling back and forth as the search parties scoured the valley floor, looking for any trace of their quarry. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and pale light filtering down from somewhere above revealed that they were in a natural cave system formed by underground water flow. The walls were smooth limestone, carved into fantastic shapes by centuries of erosion. "My grandmother brought me here when I was 7 years old," Ayanna whispered, her voice echoing in the enclosed space. "She said these caves were sacred to her people, a place where spirits dwelt. She taught me the passages that lead through the mountain to the other side. They could hear horses passing overhead, the sound of hoofbeats muffled by layers of rock and earth." The search was continuing, but for now, they were safe in their underground refuge. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, Ilias could see that the chamber was decorated with ancient pictographs, images of buffalo and elk. warriors and hunters, painted on the stone walls by people who had lived in these mountains long before white settlers ever arrived. Your grandmother's people made these? He asked. Ayanna nodded, running her fingers over one of the painted figures with reverence. The old stories say this was a place of visions, where young warriors came to seek guidance from the spirits. My grandmother was brought here as a bride, captured in a raid when she was my age. But she learned to love my grandfather, and she came to see the Lakota as her true people. The parallel to their own situation was obvious, but neither of them spoke it aloud. Instead, they settled against the cave wall to wait, listening for sounds that would tell them when it was safe to emerge. Hours passed in the dim underground chamber. The sounds of the search gradually faded as the war parties expanded their hunt to other areas of the valley. Elias and Ayanna spoke in whispers, sharing stories of their lives, their hopes, their fears for the future. She told him about her childhood in the Lakota camp, about the grandmother who had taught her to be independent and strong, about the slow realization that her father saw her only as a political asset to be traded for advantage. He told her about his years as a lawman, about the gradual corruption he had witnessed in territorial politics, about the loneliness of his 3 years in the mountain cabin. As the day wore on, their conversation became more intimate. Sitting close together in the darkness, their voices barely audible even to each other, they began to acknowledge the attraction that had been building between them since the previous night. When I first saw you standing in my doorway, Elias admitted, I thought you were a vision. Something my mind had conjured up out of loneliness and too much whiskey. And when you took me in without question, without demanding explanations, Ayanna replied, I knew you were different from other white men I had known. You saw me as a person, not as a prize to be claimed or a curiosity to be examined. Their hands found each other in the darkness, fingers intertwining as they sat side by side against the ancient stone. The attraction between them had grown beyond mere physical desire into something deeper, a recognition of kindred spirits who had both chosen difficult paths in pursuit of their principles. What happens now? Ayanna asked as afternoon shadows began to lengthen in the chamber above. We wait until dark, then follow these passages to the other side of the mountain, Elias replied. From there, we head west toward Utah territory. It will be a hard journey, but we can make it if we're careful. And then? He was quiet for a moment, considering possibilities he had never imagined just 24 hours earlier. Then we build a new life. Together, if that's what you want. She squeezed his hand in the darkness. It's what I want, but you need to understand what you're choosing. I can never go back to my people now. I will be dead to them, a ghost who no longer exists. And there will always be those who see our union as wrong, an abomination that violates the natural order. Let them think what they want, Elias replied firmly. I've learned that other people's opinions matter a lot less than being true to yourself. As darkness fell outside, they prepared to leave their underground sanctuary. The cave passages led through the heart of the mountain, emerging on the western slope several miles from where they had entered. It would be a difficult journey in the dark, but it was their best chance of escaping the search parties that were still combing the eastern valleys. They felt their way through narrow tunnels and across underground streams, guided by Ayanna's childhood memories and the faint movement of air that indicated openings to the outside world. The passages seemed to go on forever, a maze of stone corridors that branched and twisted through the mountain's heart. Finally, they saw stars ahead, the narrow mouth of a cave opening onto the western slope. They emerged into the cool night air to find themselves high on a mountainside with the lights of a distant settlement twinkling in the valley below. Bitter Creek, Ayanna identified the settlement, a mining town. We can buy supplies there and continue west. They made their way down the mountain slope, moving carefully in the darkness to avoid loose rocks and hidden crevices. The descent took most of the night, but as dawn broke over the eastern peaks behind them, they reached the outskirts of Bitter Creek. The town was a rough collection of wooden buildings clustered around a creek that had given the settlement its name. Miners and prospectors filled the muddy streets, men who had come west seeking fortune and cared little about the personal histories of their neighbors. Elias used some of his saved gold to purchase supplies and 2 horses from the livery stable. The proprietor asked no questions about their origins or destination. In mining towns, anonymity was a valued commodity. They rode west out of Bitter Creek as the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, following wagon trails that led toward the Utah Territory and the promise of a new beginning. Behind them, the mountains where they had spent their desperate night were already becoming distant peaks on the horizon. But their escape was not yet complete. As they topped a rise several miles west of town, Ayanna suddenly stiffened in her saddle and pointed back toward the trail behind them. "Riders," she said grimly. Elias turned to look and saw them, a small group of horsemen silhouetted against the morning sky, following their trail with the persistence of bloodhounds. Even at this distance, he could recognize the distinctive silhouettes of Crow warriors. "Iron Wolf's men," Ayanna confirmed. "They must have picked up our trail in Bitter Creek." The chase was beginning again, but this time they were better prepared. They had horses, supplies, and a clear destination. More importantly, they had each other, 2 outcasts who had found something worth fighting for in the most unlikely of circumstances. Elias spurred his horse forward, and Ayanna matched his pace as they galloped west toward the setting sun and whatever future awaited them beyond the horizon. Behind them, the pursuit continued, but ahead lay the promise of freedom and the chance to build a life together, far from the conflicts that had driven them into the wilderness. The Utah Territory stretched before them like an open book, its pages blank and ready to be written with the story of their love and their determination to create something beautiful from the ashes of their old lives. The journey would be long and dangerous, but they would face it together, 2 hearts beating as one against the backdrop of the endless western sky. As they rode, Ayanna began to sing softly in her native tongue, a Lakota traveling song that spoke of long journeys and distant horizons. The melody carried on the wind, mixing with the thunder of hoofbeats and the promise of adventure that lay ahead. In the distance, the mountains of Utah rose like purple shadows against the sky, beckoning them toward a future that neither could have imagined when Ayanna first knocked on Elias's door in the midst of that terrible storm. But sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected encounters, and sometimes love was found in the last place anyone thought to look. They rode on through the morning, leaving behind the past and racing toward a future that would be entirely of their own making. The pursuit continued behind them, but it no longer mattered. They had found each other, and that was worth any risk, any danger, any sacrifice that the world might demand. The story of the native girl who knocked on his door, covered only in mud, had become something far greater. A tale of 2 souls who had chosen love over duty, freedom over security, and hope over fear. And as they disappeared into the vast expanse of the American West, their love story became part of the legend of the frontier, where anything was possible for those brave enough to seize their destiny with both hands. 3 days later, they reached the settlement of Cedar Falls in eastern Utah Territory. The town was larger than Bitter Creek, with actual streets instead of muddy pathways, and buildings made of stone rather than hastily constructed wood. Mormon settlers had established the community with the methodical planning that characterized their colonization of the territory. Elias and Ayanna had pushed their horses hard to reach this sanctuary, stopping only briefly to rest and water their mounts at hidden springs known to Ayanna from stories her grandmother had shared. The pursuit had continued relentlessly, always just far enough behind to remain out of sight, but close enough to keep the pressure constant. They rode into Cedar Falls as evening shadows stretched across the main street, 2 dust-covered travelers who attracted little attention among the steady flow of westward migrants. The Mormon settlers were accustomed to seeing all manner of people passing through their territory: prospectors, Traders, families seeking new homes, and occasionally fugitives fleeing from various forms of justice. At the general store, they purchased additional supplies and learned that a wagon train was forming to head west toward California. The wagon master was looking for experienced riders to serve as scouts and guards, and he asked no questions about their backgrounds when Elias demonstrated his skill with firearms. "We leave at dawn," the wagon master, a grizzled man named Samuel Garrett, informed them. "It's a hard journey across the desert, but there's safety in numbers, and California's got opportunities for folks willing to work." That night, they camped with the wagon train outside town, sharing a small fire with other travelers who were also seeking new beginnings in the promised land of California. Ayanna sat close to Elias, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched the flames dance in the darkness. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. She lifted her head to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Only that it took so long for me to find the courage to choose my own path. What about you?" Elias thought about his empty cabin back in the Wyoming mountains, about the solitary life he had built there after leaving Denver. It seemed like a lifetime ago, that existence of self-imposed exile and loneliness. "None at all," he replied, pulling her closer. "Sometimes the best decisions are the ones that seem impossible until you make them." The wagon train departed Cedar Falls at dawn, a line of canvas-covered wagons stretching nearly a quarter-mile along the dusty trail. Elias and Ayanna rode alongside as outriders, helping to scout the route ahead and watch for potential dangers. The Utah desert was a harsh landscape of red rock formations and scattered sagebrush, beautiful in its stark emptiness but unforgiving to those unprepared for its challenges. Water was scarce, the sun merciless during the day, and the temperature dropped dramatically after sunset. But they were together, and that made all the hardships bearable. During the long days of travel, they shared stories and dreams for their future. During the cold desert nights, they found warmth in each other's arms beneath the vast canopy of western stars. On the fifth day out from Cedar Falls, as they crested a ridge overlooking a broad valley, Ayanna suddenly reined in her horse and pointed toward the eastern horizon. "Smoke," she said simply. Elias followed her gaze and saw the thin column of black smoke rising into the clear desert air. It was too far away to see details, but the implications were clear. Someone was following their trail, and they had stopped to make camp or perhaps to burn something. "Signal fire?" Elias asked. "More likely they are destroying evidence of their passage to avoid questions from territorial authorities," Ayanna replied. "Iron Wolf's warriors would not want to explain their presence in Utah territory if challenged by Mormon militia." The wagon train continued its westward journey, but Elias and Ayanna now knew that pursuers were still behind them, still determined to complete their mission regardless of how far the chase might lead them. 2 weeks later, they reached the California border and the relative safety of Sacramento. The gold rush had transformed the sleepy settlement into a booming city filled with fortune seekers from around the world. It was the perfect place for two fugitives to disappear among the crowds of anonymous immigrants seeking new lives. They found lodging in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who asked no questions about their past and seemed genuinely pleased to have respectable tenants. Elias found work as a deputy sheriff, his experience as a territorial marshal making him a valuable asset to local law enforcement. Ayanna took a position teaching at the small school that served the children of immigrants and minors. 6 months later, they were married in a simple ceremony performed by a circuit preacher who specialized in frontier weddings. Mrs. Patterson served as witness, along with several other residents of the boarding house who had become friends. The pursuit had finally ended somewhere in the Nevada desert. Whether Iron Wolf's warriors had given up the chase or met with some misfortune, Elias and Ayanna never learned. What mattered was that they were free to build the life they had dreamed of during those desperate days of flight across the western territories. Years passed peacefully in Sacramento. Elias was eventually elected sheriff, respected for his fairness and his ability to maintain order in a community filled with rough characters and competing interests. Ayanna became known as one of the finest teachers in the territory, beloved by her students and their families. They built a small house on the outskirts of town, with a garden where Ayanna grew vegetables and herbs according to knowledge passed down from her grandmother. In the evenings, they would sit on their front porch and watch the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Sometimes, in quiet moments, they would remember that terrible night when she had knocked on his door covered in mud, seeking shelter from both the storm and the life she could no longer endure. It seemed like something that had happened to other people in another lifetime. But they never forgot the lesson they had learned during those dangerous days of pursuit across the frontier, that love was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any hardship that the world might demand. And whenever young couples came to them seeking advice about marriage or life, they would tell them that the best love stories often began with the most impossible circumstances. The native girl who had knocked on his door covered only in mud had become his wife, his partner, his closest friend, and greatest love. And the lonely deputy marshal who had opened that door to a stranger in need had found the missing piece of his soul that he never knew he was searching for. Together, they had created something beautiful from the ashes of their old lives, proving that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could lead to the greatest happiness. Their love story became part of Sacramento's folklore, told and retold whenever people gathered to share tales of the early days when California was still young and anything seemed possible for those brave enough to seize their destiny.